Hi everyone, and welcome to Cozy by Caroline, where I help you learn the art of knitting from the very beginning. Today's video, we're going to be going through knitting supplies, so everything from knitting needles to yarn to all the odds and ends that'll be helpful on your journey. If you've never picked up knitting needles before, or if you're just curious what to buy, this video is for you. Let's start with the most obvious tool, knitting needles. There are a few types to choose from: straight, double pointed, and circular needles. Straight needles are probably the ones that you think of. They're pictured in TV and movies and books, and they tend to be the ones that I choose for beginners. Straight needles are used to knit flat projects like scarves or dishcloths or blankets, though circular needles are what I actually suggest for blankets, but we'll get there in a minute. Circular needles have two needle tips connected by a cord. Now this cord here is short, but you can have any length. These can be used to knit in the round, so those projects like the hats and sweaters, but they can also be used in the same way as straight needles and knit for flat projects. I like to use circular needles with a long cord for my blankets because it makes more room for the stitches to be held on your needle. If you try and bunch 100 or more stitches onto a straight needle, they're more likely to fall off the end and cause issues. So I like to use circular needles with a long cord and just knit back and forth as flat. Double pointed needles are also used to knit in the round, usually on a smaller circumference, so things like socks or sweater sleeves you'll see generally use double pointed needles. They look intimidating, but once you kind of get the hang of it, it's much easier than it looks. Needles also come in a variety of materials. Typically you'll see them in metal, plastic, or some sort of wood, usually bamboo. Metal needles are usually more slippery, so they work well for when you're trying to increase your speed or if you have kind of a grippier textured yarn. Bamboo needles will hold on to your stitches a little bit better. That's why I recommend them for beginners, because there's less risk of your stitches falling off of your needles accidentally. Sizing of your needles is maybe the most important factor to consider when you're picking out your first set of knitting needles. It will depend on your pattern and or the yarn that you choose. Sizes are notated in both US and metric system, and they range from US size 0 all the way up to US size 50. In metric, that's 2 millimeters to 25 millimeters. Your yarn will dictate the suggested size. I'll show you that when we get to looking at a label for yarn, how to read what size knitting needle that you need. With all that, let's dive into my favorite topic, which is yarn. There are 3 important things that you need to know about yarn as a beginner. All 3 can be found on any yarn label that you choose. The first thing that you need to know about yarn is that it comes in different sizes or weights. The weight of the yarn tells you the thickness of the strand of yarn that you're choosing. These sizes range from 0 to 7, also known as lace weight to jumbo. You can see this here on the yarn label and the suggested needle size. For beginners, I personally like to suggest a super bulky weight 6 yarn. It works up really fast and is easy to manage, and it pairs well with size US 15, otherwise known as 10 millimeter knitting needles. Another consideration is the material of the yarn. You'll often see wool, acrylic, and cotton. Sometimes you'll see a blend. My personal favorite yarn is a wool acrylic blend, which makes it machine washable but still gives you like the warmth of the wool. As you get to know more fibers, you'll also find things like bamboo and linen, different blanket yarns, and you'll find your favorites over time. The world of yarn is kind of never ending and super fun to discover new things. I have been knitting for 20 years and I still discover new fibers that are more fun to work with. Favorite yarn fiber is completely personal preference. Sometimes it depends on the season. So cotton will be lighter and better for warmer temperatures, while wool and acrylic will kind of keep you warmer and is better for the colder months. Now, of course, yarn comes in all different colors. This is entirely up to you what colors that you like, and you can have fun picking out what colors work best for a different project that you're working on. However, as a beginner, I do have a suggestion. Darker colored yarns are harder to see your stitches. For example, it's well known in the knitting world that black or dark blue yarn is really difficult to work with. You can only see the stitches so well. So as a beginner, I highly recommend using a lighter colored yarn. I also recommend using a solid color for when you're first starting out, because sometimes the different specs and things that you see can cause some issues. You want your first time working with yarn to be as easy and clear as possible. So a light colored yarn and a solid color are my suggestions for beginners. Besides the yarn and needles, there are a few other tools that I think will be helpful and maybe necessary on your knitting journey. The first is called a yarn needle or a darning needle. This is just what you think of as a typical sewing needle, but it has a larger eye so that your yarn can fit through it rather than just thread. You'll use this to weave in ends at the end of a project, or if you're working on something that requires a seam, you'll use it for that too. Stitch markers are also essential in knitting. Sometimes you'll use them on larger projects, but you'll certainly use them when knitting in the round. Stitch markers are used to show you the place that you are in your work. So when knitting in the round, the stitch marker will show you the beginning of each row. Often when I'm just knitting a hat in the round, I'll just use extra yarn that I have and kind of tie it into a loop. Though for a larger project like a sweater, you'll probably want some removable stitch markers. Other tools are a little bit more obvious, such as scissors, measuring tape. A row counter can be helpful, but completely optional. Now that was a lot of information that I just threw at you, so if you've gone through this whole video and you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, that's okay. Let me tell you exactly what you need in order to start knitting, the bare minimum. You need one set of knitting needles. I recommend a straight 10mm, also known as US 15 knitting needle. You'll need one ball of yarn. Again, I recommend a weight 6 super bulky yarn. But you can start with anything you want, just make sure that your knitting needles match that yarn. You'll also need a yarn needle and some sharp scissors. Those are the only 4 things that you need to get started with knitting today. And that's it. You can add more to your collection over time. So things like interchangeable needles, circular needles, and eventually your stash will grow as you have more needs for different things for other projects. Thank you so much for watching. In the next video, we'll actually dive into how to actually start knitting, casting on, and making your first stitches. If you found this video helpful, be sure to like and subscribe. If you have any questions, I'm an open book. I would love to help you with what you're working on with your knitting, so be sure to comment below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.